British Marines have recaptured South Georgia.
The message we've got is that British troops landed on South Georgia this afternoon, shortly after 4 p.m. London time. They have now successfully taken control of Grytviken. At about 6 p.m. London time, the white flag was hoisted in Grytviken beside the Argentine flag, and shortly afterwards the Argentine forces there surrendered to British forces.
Rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Task Force helicopters have crippled an Argentine submarine. Argentine's foreign minister says it's technically war, and the warplanes still being added to Britain's Atlantic fighting force. The crisis over the Falklands became a conflict today, 23 days after Argentina took the islands. The Ministry of Defence confirmed in London that British forces had landed on South Georgia, and a few minutes ago Mr. John Nott announced that Argentine forces had surrendered. Mrs. Thatcher said the Marines had done a marvellous job. Tonight's news follows a day of conflicting reports about clashes between the Royal Navy and Argentine forces. The British assault came at first light when the Ministry of Defence issued a statement saying, "In pursuance of our inherent right to self-defence, British helicopters today attacked a hostile Argentine submarine in the vicinity of South Georgia." The Argentines confirmed the attack several hours later, but they said it was on the surface in Grytviken harbour. Then came reports of helicopter attacks at Grytviken, which was followed by another defence statement, this time simply saying, "British forces are now ashore on South Georgia." In New York, Mr. Costa Mendes, the Argentine foreign minister, said Britain and Argentina were now technically at war. That dramatic announcement, made in Downing Street 40 minutes ago, ended 24 anxious hours for Mrs. Thatcher, hours she'd largely spent.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary of State for Defence has just come over to give me some very good news, and I think you'd like to have it at once.
The message we've got is that British troops landed on South Georgia this afternoon, shortly after 4 p.m. London time. They have now successfully taken control of Grytviken. At about 6 p.m. London time, the white flag was hoisted in Grytviken beside the Argentine flag, and shortly afterwards the Argentine forces there surrendered to British forces. The Argentine forces offered only limited resistance to the British troops. Our forces were landed by helicopter and were supported by a number of warships, together with a Royal Fleet auxiliary. During the first phase of this operation, our own helicopters engaged the Argentine submarine Santa Fe off South Georgia. This submarine was detected at first light and was engaged because it posed a threat to our men and to the British warships launching the landing. So far, no British casualties have been reported. At present, we have no information on the Argentine casualty position. The commander of the operation has sent the following message: "Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen."
What happens next, Mr. Nott?
Thank you very much.
Just
reaction,
rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Are we going to declare war on Argentina, Mrs. Thatcher?
Well, that dramatic announcement made in Downing Street 40 minutes ago ended 24 anxious hours for Mrs. Thatcher, as she'd largely spent in the quiet seclusion of Chequers, her country home, knowing that once the decision on military action had been taken, matters were out of her hands. The decision to turn words into actions was taken at last night's crisis cabinet meeting. According to some unconfirmed reports, even as Foreign Secretary Francis Pym was on his way to Washington last week to discuss the crisis with Secretary of State Haig, men of the Special Boat Section, the Navy's SAS, were landing on South Georgia on a reconnaissance mission. Whatever the accuracy of that report, Mr. Pym's conclusion after his 2 days in Washington that plain talking was going to achieve nothing made up the crisis cabinet's minds. A display of the government's willingness to actually use the military might of the task force to back up the diplomatic moves was necessary. The Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Terence Lewin, who attended last night's Downing Street meeting, unfolded the plan for the retaking of South Georgia. He withdrew while the politicians made their final decision, and when that was the go-ahead, he left Number 10 and walked the 200 yards to the Ministry of Defence to break the news. And so, on day 23, the crisis became a conflict. All of the details are not yet known. The reports from Britain and Argentina vary. Here's our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne.
Although South Georgia is 100 miles long and 20 miles wide, both the British and Argentines knew there was only one logical place for a landing, the harbour at Grytviken. It's a sheltered anchorage surrounded by high mountains. It was here that Argentine Marines landed on April the 3rd and fought an epic gun battle with a small group of British Royal Marine commandos. Today's action was a replay, only this time it was Argentine troops who were dug into defensive positions around the settlement and the British who came ashore. According to some reports, the first landing was made on Thursday by men of the Special Boat Service, the marine version of the SAS. That would be standard procedure, and the beach survey party's job was to note the defensive positions, count the defenders, and create a diversion when the main party arrived. But the diversion came from an unexpected quarter. Two Royal Navy Lynx helicopters, probably acting as gunships covering the landings, came across an Argentine submarine, the Santa Fe, on the surface near the harbour entrance. The Santa Fe was in a position to interfere with British military operations, under the definition given in the warning to Argentina about when and why their forces were liable to be attacked. So the Santa Fe was machine-gunned and rocketed. She limped into harbour, streaming oil, on fire, and listing to port. Tonight she's aground and still smouldering. Crippling the Santa Fe means that Argentina now has lost one of her 4 submarines. Meanwhile, the commandos were storming ashore, apparently under cover of a barrage from British warships. The Marines had been training for this moment throughout the long trip to the South Atlantic, and they landed in positions around the Argentine defenders. According to reports from Buenos Aires, there was a long and bitter firefight. But, as happened 3 weeks ago, the defenders were probably outnumbered and certainly outgunned. They had no air support and were defenceless against the Navy's shellfire. So, eventually, they surrendered. They'll now be treated as prisoners of war, and that could mean they'll be on South Georgia throughout the bitterly cold Antarctic winter. The retaking of South Georgia, using exactly the same plan of attack as the Argentine invaders, will come as particular satisfaction to the Royal Marines. It also gives the Royal Navy Task Force commander a deep water anchorage and a base from which to mount an attack on the Falkland Islands. But militarily, this was a comparatively simple action against an opponent who didn't have any air cover. The Falklands invasion will be a much tougher proposition. A statement tonight from the British Antarctic Survey at Cambridge said that they received a message at lunchtime, our time, to say that all the British scientists still on South Georgia were well and had made no mention of seeing any action. They're all living well away from where the fighting was going on.
There's still no comment from Buenos Aires on the recapture of South Georgia, but 2 days ago President Galtieri forecast that his forces on the island would die rather than surrender. It was several hours, in fact, before the Argentine junta acknowledged that there was a conflict there. That acknowledgement came in the form of a claim that the British Task Force helicopters had fired on a stationary submarine in Grytviken harbour. And then, as the junta went into emergency session, there were several hours of silence before Buenos Aires made its next statement. Before that came, we received this report from Christopher Morris.
At military headquarters in Buenos Aires, 7 hours elapsed before there was any official confirmation of the incident. Military commanders of all 3 services, the Army, Navy and Air Force, were awakened to be told of the Royal Navy's helicopter attack, seen here as a grave escalation of the crisis. At the Defence Ministry, there have been a series of meetings of the Military Committee, responsible for any action during Argentina's present state of war alert. The committee has to decide whether or not to launch any counterattack against the 3 British warships still positioned just off South Georgia. Communique number 27, when it was released by the Defence Ministry, was an announcement to the people of Argentina that in the early hours of this morning, 2 British helicopters had opened fire with machine guns at Argentine troops protecting Grytviken, the main town of South Georgia. The communique condemned Britain for a flagrant violation of the United Nations Resolution 502, which has called for Argentina's withdrawal from the Falklands and for armed conflict to be avoided. The Argentine communique also condemned Britain as an aggressor. There's already been a firm warning by the military junta that Argentine forces will respond to any British aggression. A Defence Ministry official later read out a second communiqué, claiming the submarine had been attacked while unloading provisions, medicines and mail for troops and the 30 Argentine scrap metal merchants still there dismantling the whaling station. The communiqué condemned the attack against a submarine on the surface with no means of defending itself. There was no mention of any casualties.
Well, a few minutes ago, Christopher Morris managed to get through on the telephone from Buenos Aires with a report on the latest reaction there.
The Argentine military authorities are still insisting the battle for South Georgia is going on. The latest communiqué from the Defense Ministry in Buenos Aires claims Argentine troops are still heroically resisting the bombs and the bullets of the British aggressors. There's no mention of any Argentine surrender in Grytviken, nor are there any reports of casualties, apart from the 2 crew members of the submarine which was machine-gunned and rocketed by Royal Navy helicopters. The Argentines say one of the helicopters was shot down. Britain continues to be cast in the role of the aggressor by Argentina and is accused of playing with the peace of Latin America. And in Buenos Aires, as news of the British attack spread, so crowds gathered in the central Plaza del Mayo. There's an anti-British demonstration going on at the moment, and the mood of the Argentines there is angry and ugly.
Washington was told last night of the decision to take military action in a lengthy coded cable sent from the Foreign Office to the State Department at the end of the crisis cabinet meeting. The timing can't have pleased the Americans. There were strong suggestions, albeit denied by Mr. Pym, that Mr. Haig had urged no action until after tomorrow's meeting in Washington of the foreign ministers of the Organization of American States. Their meeting to take a decision on Argentina's request for a trade embargo against Britain. Mr. Haig felt military action before that meeting would ensure a decision in Argentina's favour, and that will embarrass the United States. If he did make pleas for a delay, they fell on deaf ears. The Argentine Foreign Minister, Costa Mendes, has already arrived in the United States for the meeting and is making the most of the incident, as Martin Bell now reports.
Mr. Costa Mendes, arriving in New York, was asked, does this mean war?
Technically, yes. Técnicamente, sí.
What it also means is that diplomatic moves are being overtaken by military ones. But Mr. Costa Mendes is in Washington now for another meeting with Mr. Haig. Britain and Argentina are so far apart in their positions, the gap looks unbridgeable. But the State Department is working on the principle that as long as there's talk, there's hope.
Events are moving fast now. If tonight's meeting is negative, the United States will be under the strongest pressure to side with Britain. A final shuttle mission by Mr. Haig is not ruled out, and the foreign ministers of the OAS are to meet here tomorrow to consider a call by Argentina to invoke the Rio Treaty against Britain. That's the loose defense pact that binds the nations of the Americas together. An angry and impassioned performance by Argentina is quite certain.
Outside the OAS today, Argentina's supporters were gathering, mostly Argentine exiles, for the cause doesn't enjoy widespread backing among Americans generally. Venezuelans and Bolivians added their support, as did the Irish, drawn in by the anti-Britishness of the event. But mostly it was an occasion for Latin passion. 2,000 people were expected. Only about 600 came, but those who did jumped to it. As the rally was held, news was coming in of the British landings in South Georgia. And that'll certainly affect events inside the OAS tomorrow, when Argentina will be lobbying its friends in the hemisphere and clamouring for action against the British.
Mrs. Thatcher had spent most of the day at Chequers, keeping in close touch with the rapidly developing situation before returning tonight to Downing Street. Here's our political editor, John Cole.
The government's going to argue that the invasion of South Georgia doesn't interfere with the negotiations that Mr. Haig has been conducting for a couple of weeks now. The fact that Grytviken was captured so quickly and apparently without bloodshed, at least on the British side, will confirm the view the inner cabinet reached last night, that the negotiating process would be speeded up if the Argentines and the Americans were convinced that the Royal Naval Task Force meant business. Mr. Nott's due to make a statement on the engagement in the House of Commons tomorrow, but it's possible that the House will insist on hearing from the Prime Minister herself. Mr. Michael Foot has called a meeting of Labour's shadow cabinet for tomorrow morning. He's been in touch this evening with Mr. Dennis Healy in Philadelphia. Neither is reacting until the government's reported to the Commons, but Labour's position is likely to be that any military operation which doesn't interfere with the negotiations is acceptable, and that a bloodless occupation of South Georgia would be welcome. This afternoon, while news of the operation was still coming in, Mr. Tony Benn was at a peace demonstration in central London and took a message to Downing Street. He was asked what he thought the latest developments would mean.
I fear it will make it much harder now. And the one thing that is so clear is that a majority of the British people are opposed to a war.
But do you think that at this early stage it is helpful for you to be criticising the position the government has taken?
We're criticising the government. The Navy didn't decide to go to the Falklands. We are standing up for the true interests of our servicemen. Don't let Mrs. Thatcher now shield behind the servicemen and women she has put at risk. They decided. We didn't decide.
So you
and what we should do is to speak our minds. That's what democracy is about. You see, truth is the first casualty of war.
But for the moment, with victory at Great Beacon, the broad political unity at Westminster will continue. The strains about what the government should do now, and particularly what compromises it should make in the negotiations, are still there, on the Conservative benches as well as on the opposition side. But the House of Commons' first reaction will be one of heartfelt relief.
Britain had clearly telegraphed ahead that military action was in the offing, going as far as warning the 17,000 British citizens in Argentina to leave. Unable to leave are the 3 British journalists detained in the south of the country and accused of spying. A judge has decided that there is a case to answer, though they'll be making an application for bail this week. From Tierra del Fuego, Philip Hayton has sent this report.
The judge announced his decision at a news conference in his office. He said the journalists' notebooks and photographs indicated that charges of spying were justified, and he ruled that until a full hearing, they must be kept in custody. His judgment surprised many people, especially the 3 defendants: Ian Mather, defense correspondent of The Observer, Simon Winchester of the Sunday Times, and Observer photographer Tony Prime. All along, they've maintained they were ordinary journalists doing their job, and they were convinced that would secure their release.
And I'm bound to feel now, in this very disappointing moment, that our being British is one of the principal problems. But having said that, I do have great faith in the system of justice in Argentina, that this eventually will be resolved with the declaration of our innocence and our freedom.
The journalists left court to spend their 9th night in custody. A friend called it the worst night of their lives. Defense lawyers now plan to appeal against the decision not to grant bail. If they're convicted, the Fleet Street men each face jail sentences of 2 to 8 years.
The liner Canberra, now converted into a troop ship, has also had an encounter with an Argentine vessel. It was with the cargo ship Rio de la Plata, which came close, presumably, to observe the Canberra. It was the second time this has happened, as Jeremy Hands reports.
This morning it reappeared much closer to the British force, and a frigate was immediately sent to investigate. The Argentine vessel turned out to be the 10,000-ton Rio de la Plata, based in and operating out of Buenos Aires. As the frigate, a Type 21 capable of high speed, intercepted the freighter, it moved away and back out to sea. The frigate's helicopter was sent up to get a closer look and to check for radio equipment. No other action was taken by the British ships, although any doubt that the Argentines know where we are has now gone.
Further reinforcements are preparing to leave Britain to join the task force in the South Atlantic. 900 men of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, have been getting ready to sail tomorrow on the ferry Norland. Her departure from Portsmouth has been postponed because work is still being carried out to strengthen her decks. The men joining the Norland have recently returned from Northern Ireland, and until the Falklands crisis, expected to go to Belize.
The requisitioned container ship Atlantic Conveyor took aboard Navy helicopters, including the Wessex type and the big twin-rotor Chinooks. Both are capable of acting as troop carriers. During a week at Devonport Dockyard, hangar space has been created below, and her deck has been strengthened to accommodate the helicopters and the complement of Harrier jump jets expected to rendezvous with the ship at sea. In preparation for that, one Sea Harrier arrived in the Sound this afternoon to make trial landings on the unfamiliar deck.
There'll be a Newsnight special on BBC2 at 10:30 with the latest on the Falklands conflict. There'll also be political reaction at home and from the British representative at the United Nations in New York. Now the rest of the news. Israel has completed her withdrawal from Sinai after almost 15 years of occupation.
In Argentina, the government hasn't yet declared war, but